Good afternoon. Welcome to the Alabama edition of our state webinar series exploring the findings from American Farmland Trust's recently released Farms Under Threat, the State of the States report. Before we get started, let me run through some logistics to help make this a good experience. Everyone has been muted, so no need to do that yourself. If you would like to ask a question or make a comment, you can do so by going to the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. The orange arrow at the top of that panel allows the panel to shrink and reopen. You'll see a question section of the control panel. You can pop that section out by clicking on the little square on the right-hand side. That decouples it from the control panel. You can then type your questions and comments in there, and we will have time for question and answer during and at the end of the presentation. We are recording this webinar and will send the link to everyone who registered. Please feel free to share this recording with others. Let me now introduce myself. I'm Chris Coffin. I'm American Farmland Trust Senior Policy Advisor. I also direct our newly launched National Agricultural Land Network, which I'll talk about at the end of the webinar. Co-hosting with me is Billy Van Pelt. Billy is AFT's Senior Director of External Relations and is based in Kentucky. Billy is focused on the expansion of AFT's national initiatives across the Southeast. For those of you not familiar with American Farmland Trust, let me do a quick introduction. AFT is a national nonprofit membership organization founded in 1980. Some know us best by our No Farms, No Food bumper sticker. We work from kitchen tables to the halls of Congress. We are an agricultural land trust, but also focus on promoting sound farming practices through soil health and water quality initiatives. We also recognize that it's not farmland without farmers. So we focus on tools and strategies that facilitate land access for next generation producers and assist with farm transfer and succession for retiring farmers and farmland owners. Our programming and research informs our state and federal policy development and advocacy. We have 6 regional offices and a national office located in Washington, D.C. And so now let me turn it over to Billy.
Thanks, Chris. We are delighted to be joined today by a number of valued partners, including the Alabama Cooperative Extension and Auburn University, Partnership for Gulf Coast Land Conservation, the Nature Conservancy, Athens Land Trust, the Wallace Center, and numerous farms and agricultural partners from around the state. Thank you all for joining us today. We'd like to recognize and thank NRCS, especially for their collaboration and support of this project. They've been an integral partner, as has our research partner in this project, Conservation Science Partners.
Thanks, Billy. So let's talk now about the findings from this report. Today we're focusing on the State of the States, which is the second in this research series. State of the States paints a striking picture of the threats facing working farms and ranches in every state and documents the steps every state has taken to protect their agricultural land base from development. We used a multi-pronged approach that included advanced spatial mapping to identify the threats to agricultural land and an in-depth analysis of state policy responses. We're using this report to raise public awareness, to inform state and federal policy, and to encourage more direct and permanent agricultural land protection. For those of you who did not join us for our launch event in May, let me touch very quickly on the national findings. From 2001 to 2016, a period of historically low housing starts, the U.S. converted 11 million acres of agricultural land. That's equivalent to all the land planted in the U.S. to fruits, nuts, and vegetables in 2017. The majority of that conversion was to low-density residential land use. We've known this type of conversion was happening because all across the country, scattered large lot housing has been fragmenting and disrupting farming and ranching for years. But until this report, no one has ever been able to map it and measure it. And once we mapped it, we realized just how big of a threat it is. Importantly, more than 1/3 of the land converted, about 4.5 million acres, was what we have identified as nationally significant land. That's land best suited for intensive food and crop production. As you can see from this next map, agricultural land conversion is a growing problem across the US and no longer confined to large metropolitan areas. Small cities are sprawling, and the proliferation of farmettes and ranchettes on their outskirts has created hotspots of conversion in virtually every state. So let's now dive into the data available for Alabama on our new interactive website. And we will be ably assisted in our cruise through the websites today by our colleague and navigator, Beth Frazier. Thank you, Beth. Let's start with pointing out this tab over here, the Reports and Data tab. This is where you'll find fact sheets that describe various methodologies used. There's also the full report, a glossary. And if you are interested in getting access to the geospatial data we used, we will be making that available. The way to request access is to go to this geospatial data layers where Beth has the pointer. Click on that and you will find a form to fill out, and we will be back in touch with further details. So now let's go to the drop-down menu and focus on Alabama. And you can see from here, you can go to both spatial mapping and the policy scorecard, and we're going to start on spatial mapping. And before we actually go into this, we are going to point out the fact of a couple of summary documents that might be useful. You see Download Alabama Conversion Summary. This is a 2-page highlight document. There is a similar one for the Policy Scorecard. We hope you will find it useful for use in for infographics, for your own newsletters, for your own outreach, for conversations with reporters or with policymakers. We hope it will serve a variety of different needs and that you will find it useful. So as we go back to the website, we're going to look at the 4 categories of spatial data we've created. We're starting with land cover and use. Farms Under Threat, the State of the States, uses multiple national data sets to develop the best available spatial inventory of agricultural land use in the US. You can zoom in on this data layer to identify every type of land use in the state, including land that we've identified as low density residential development. It also includes a first ever attempt to spatially identify woodland associated with a farm or ranch. Our mapping shows 9.8 million acres of agricultural land in Alabama, including 3.2 million acres of cropland, 3.5 million of pasture land, and 3 million of woodland associated with a farm. So let's turn to PVR values now. For Farms Under Threat, we wanted to analyze the quality of land that is being lost to development, not just the quantity. So we created, with the help of a national panel of experts, an index to quantify the productivity, versatility, and resiliency of every acre of land in the US. This map shows the range of these PVR values across the state. The darker the green, the higher the PVR value, the lighter going into that light tan, the lower the PVR value. Higher PVR values indicate higher suitability for long-term intensive crop production, especially for food crops such as fruits, nuts, vegetables, and staple grains. So these PVR values were used to identify nationally significant land. This next map shows the nationally significant agricultural land in Alabama. You'll see that about 4.5 million acres of land falls into this category, about 46% of the state's land base. About 2.3 million acres of this is cropland, with 1.3 million of it in pasture and almost 900,000 acres of woodland. The loss of this highly productive land has both economic and environmental implications. When nationally significant land is impacted by development, intensive food production is pushed to marginal lands. The economic impact is that those input costs for producers are likely then higher, crop yields are typically lower, and from an environmental perspective, soils degrade more quickly on those marginal lands. So looking finally at conversion, the data looks at a 15-year period from 2001 to 2016. Again, a period of historically low housing starts with a deep recession in the middle. We mapped the conversion of agricultural land to two types of land use. Both of these are seen in the red here. The first is urban and highly developed land use, or UHD. This includes the traditional culprits in farmland conversion, so expanding residential, commercial, and industrial areas, typically found in cities and towns. But this category also includes rural, industrial, and energy production sites, including oil and well pads and solar panel installations. The second type is low-density residential development, or LDR. This is the first effort of its kind to quantify the extent of large lot housing on the agricultural land base. LDR areas range from lower density subdivisions to rural areas where more and more individual houses are being built. You can see that the vast majority of conversion, 262,000 acres or 72% over this time frame, was to low density residential. This doesn't mean that there is no active agriculture on land designated as LDR. There may well be, and some of it may be very productive. We know that small farm parcels can be productive and profitable, but we also know that LDR tends to be a transitional land use. Land in Alabama that was considered LDR in 2001 was 8 times more likely to be converted to urban and highly developed land by 2016 than other agricultural land. And we know the continued conversion to LDR increases management challenges for producers who have to deal with farming in and around non-farm neighbors. Total agricultural land converted over this 15-year period was just over 362,000 acres. Pasture land accounted for about 142,000 of that, followed by cropland with 126,000 acres and woodland with almost 94,000. And in looking at the quality of the land converted, 52% of converted land was considered nationally significant. With that, let me stop and turn it over to Billy for some perspectives about the spatial findings.
Thanks, Chris. And just wanted to take a look at the map. I know Beth is going to be helping us out here. So as we look at this map, you'll see the red areas. This is a historic look at conversion that has taken place over a 15-year period from 2001 to 2016. Of this red, 28% was converted to the urban, highly developed areas, and 72% was converted to low-density residential. But the patterns that we're seeing here are very interesting because, for example, around Montgomery is surrounded by a significant amount of PBR land, productive, versatile, and resilient land. So there is an example of where we've had a lot of conversion over that 15-year period of that PBR land. So this is where we need to make changes in how we plan for the future of agriculture. If we scroll up on the map to Huntsville, we'll see that Huntsville is in an area that where there is a significant amount of sprawl as well. And so we also see a lot of PVR land there, productive, versatile, and resilient soils. So the concern here is that we're protecting our best soils while planning for future non-agricultural uses in urban areas, and we are planning for the future of agriculture. So we're going to be talking about a suite of planning tools later. At this time, I'll call your attention to Birmingham, and I think here it's perhaps the clearest illustration of the sprawl that we're talking about, where we have sprawl fanning across the central part of the state with no concerted, compact, contiguous development, and with a center urban area and dedicated areas to agriculture. So we'll talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. Thanks, Beth.
Okay. So before we turn to the policy scorecard, we want to stop and actually get some input from all of you. We are interested in your perspectives on what you think will drive agricultural land conversion over the next 10 to 20 years in Alabama. Understanding what will drive conversion will help to determine what policy responses will be most important. So you see here the options. You can select more than one. And if you have any trouble voting, it might be because you are in full screen mode, which you have to get out of in order to vote. So we'll take a minute for people to vote. Okay, Beth, okay, so this is interesting that it's sort of more of what we know has been a driver in the past, and that's more particularly poorly planned housing, residential, and commercial and industrial development. This is consistent with folks in other states where we've been doing webinars who also see the generational transfer as an emerging threat. And also with some folks feeling that, again, continued profitability in agriculture will remain a challenge, as will more and poorly planned energy development. So thank you for weighing in there. We're going to turn now to the policy scorecard. Our intention with the scorecard is to highlight effective elements of state policies that address the conversion, the drivers of agricultural land conversion that we were just talking about. So poorly planned development, weak agricultural viability, and the fact that land is most vulnerable when it transfers between generations. Well, AFT has been at the forefront of federal and state policy development around farm and ranch land retention and protection since our founding. This is our first effort at a state policy scorecard. We know that there are many ways that states can support agriculture, and this is not an attempt to score them all. We know, for example, that many states have marketing programs. Those are tremendously important. We know that many have grants and loan programs and think of agriculture and have economic development authorities that deal with all types of support for agriculture. In what we focused on were 6 different types of policies and programs that tie directly to the land. And I'll just point to the fact that we do have a policy summary that you can download. Suggest that you do that at some point because we hope it will be useful. But in thinking and talking about the 6 policies and programs, you're fine, Beth, that these are the 6 we looked at. So purchase of agricultural conservation easement programs. These are often known as purchase of development right programs or farmland preservation programs. They are voluntary programs that compensate landowners who choose to place a permanent agricultural conservation easement on their property. We looked at land use planning and growth management. Land use planning policies manage growth and stabilize the land base. Most states, including Alabama, delegate planning authority to local governments, and planning and zoning decisions are largely driven at the county and municipal level. As Billy will discuss, the suite of tools available to county and local governments to support compact development and retain agricultural land must be robust. But states can play an active and important role in steering and supporting these decisions in a way that supports the agricultural land base. And so that's what this policy component measures. We looked at property tax relief for agricultural land. These are programs that reduce property taxes paid on agricultural land in recognition that working lands require far less in municipal services than residential development. The most common approach is use value assessment, which assess farmland at its current use. Agricultural district programs are those that encourage landowners to form special areas to support agriculture. Participating farmers receive protections and incentives that differ by state. Some states limit annexation in districts, while others limit use of eminent domain and offer protection from the siting of public facilities and infrastructure. Some offer tax incentives, and some require district enrollment to participate in state-administered PACE programs. We then looked at 2 policies and programs that are focused on this generational transfer and providing opportunities for next generation producers. These are farm link programs that connect farm seekers with farmers and landowners who want their land to stay in agriculture. They can be administered by public or private entities and offer a range of services and resources from online real estate postings to technical assistance, trainings, and educational resources. We included only state-supported programs here. And lastly, state leasing. These are programs or policies that make state-owned land available to farmers for agriculture. Sometimes that's their primary purpose. More often, agricultural use is secondary to generating income for a public purpose or protecting wildlife habitat. So if you go down, we can see how Alabama scores relative to other states. And what we like to point out here is that some states, especially on the east and west coasts, have faced rapid loss of farmland for decades. And so the high scores here reflect the actions they've had to take to stem the rapid conversion of their farm and ranch land. As Alabama now begins to feel this development pressure, it will similarly need to increase its policy response if it hopes to retain its land base for a profitable agricultural industry. The website allows you to dive into the factors behind each score, and we're going to look at them a little bit. You go to the select policy or program. And let's start with PACE program. So you'll see when we get to Alabama that Alabama gets points for having acquired about 20 easements beginning in 2004, 2005. High scoring states here have used a variety of funding sources, from appropriations and bonds to deed recording fees to specialty license plate fees to finance permanent farmland protection programs. What's important to note here is that the Federal Agricultural Conservation Easement Program provides an important source of matching funds for anyone interested in doing farmland protection in Alabama, as does USDA's Regional Conservation Partnership Program. Both provide a one-to-one cash match, so are a great deal for taxpayers. The 2018 Farm Bill also eliminated the cash match requirement for the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, so landowners willing to donate 50% of the value of their easement can participate in the program if they work with a land trust or a public PACE program. We hope that the $2 billion in funding for ASEP and the increased funding for RCPP in the 2018 Farm Bill will help to spur farmland protection activity in Alabama. So moving to land use planning, as I mentioned earlier, our intent with this piece of the scorecard is to look at how every state government is steering or supporting decisions in a way that supports the agricultural land base. And you'll see for Alabama, and I should have said here that down below, which Beth will show in a minute, that you see their details about how we scored things, which you may find helpful. That how we scored it here, you'll see that Alabama gets points for state plan for agriculture. So it's the 2015 to 2020 strategic plan to grow Alabama's agriculture, agribusiness, forestry, and forest products industry. It didn't get full credit here because the plan does not address agricultural land. And that is something that will be important to do in order to reach the plan's goal of significantly growing these industries' contribution to the Alabama economy. It also gets points for enabling local planning commissions and requiring those commissions to adopt master plans. States that scored well in this policy support local governments in developing comprehensive plans. They also tend to have state goals around both compact development and retaining their agricultural land base. So quickly, we're just going to look at the last two for Alabama, looking at property tax relief. Alabama gets points in this category for having a rollback tax requirement on its current use assessment program. States that scored high in this policy use those withdrawal penalties often to help fund their farmland protection efforts. They also track their enrolled acres and require verification that land is in active agricultural use in order to be eligible. And then lastly, on state leasing, Alabama scores well above the median here in having an agency that seems to be responsible for inventorying state-owned lands and their suitability for agriculture. It also gets high points for its lease terms. States that were at the top in this category have done a comprehensive inventory of state-owned land that could be made available for farming and then promote the use of that land through an open and transparent process. We feel that state-owned land and leasing provides an important mechanism for identifying particularly new land access opportunities, especially smaller plot parcels in and near urban areas. Let me stop there. The one point that we make around Farm Link is that we understand that in many states that there are nonprofits who are engaged and looking to do more in the arena of farm linking and trying to provide that support to help match farmers who are getting out of the business and those who want to get into it and who are looking for land opportunities. The reason we included it here as a state policy is because we believe that this is so important that it requires some amount of state support and investment to ensure that this kind of activity happens statewide. And we would note that sometimes this is done through extension services, and so state support for those extension support services are important. So now we're going to leave the website, and as we do, we're going to launch a poll which asks which policy or policies you think would be most valuable to focus on for Alabama. And I apologize, we were not able to put state leasing and farm link in here. We know they are important. If you feel they are the most important, please write them in on your question line. And again, you can select more than one. Okay, let's see. So, not surprisingly, this is again similar to what we see in other states as well. People very interested in land use planning, and that's, I suspect, both at what more can the states do to be supportive and what more can be done at the county and municipal level. Interesting that there is significant interest in agricultural districts, which does seem like it could be a way to provide a number of important protections and benefits for producers and landowners in Alabama. The National Agricultural Land Network will be hosting a series of policy webinars beginning in the early fall, which we hope will be a way for those of you who want to learn more about some of these specific policy elements. So we will keep you posted about those and hope that people will join to learn more on this front. One thing missing from our spatial analysis is protected agricultural land, because there is not a comprehensive data layer focused on agricultural land protection. We are building this new database now. You see that we have obviously you see some green spots, so we have some data from around the country. If you are an organization or entity that holds agricultural conservation easements and you haven't heard from us, please do let us know by adding a comment in the question panel. If that's the case, we will be in touch with you. So let's pause and see, Billy, if there are any questions.
Thanks, Chris. Let's take a look. I am noticing as these trends that we're seeing in all of our webinars is the concern about local planning. And that's going to be the perfect segue for me as I move into the next part of the presentation. We don't have any questions at this time. And so I do see a question now. Thank you very much. And the question is, can you discuss some of the sources for your map layers? Do you want to take that question, Chris?
Yeah, sure, I can. We used a large variety of data layers that were all national in scope. So probably first was national cover, NC, national, and again, you can tell I'm not the GIS specialist and I was not the researcher in this project, but national cover data layer, we looked at a number of, we looked at crop data layers. We looked at national land cover. We looked at soil suitability and the land capability classes when we were putting together the low density residential land use. We looked at a combination of housing. We did that modeling through the use of census housing blocks and the census of agriculture for the purpose of putting together that woodland associated with farms. We basically triangulated between the information in the census of agriculture through what we were seeing through land cover, land use data, You will find all of that information in the methodology section of the website, which again is on that reports and data tab. And I should say that we ground truthed a large amount of the conversion data with USDA NRCS's NRI data, so that we had a high degree of consistency, I think is the term to use, that we were given access to that NRI data that I believe is not all publicly available. So it gave us a pretty comprehensive ability to ground truth a lot of our data.
I don't see any more questions, Chris. And Beth, why don't we move on to the next slide? So I want to share for our audience that time is not on our side in saving our farm and ranch land, which is why American Farmland Trust just announced a bold goal of doubling the amount of permanently protected farmland by 2040 and reducing the rate of farmland conversion from 2,000 acres a day to 500 acres a day by 2040. We know that to get to this goal, we will all need to lock arms with as many partners and practitioners on this call and others across the U.S. who are deeply concerned about saving the land that sustains us. So now what I'd like to do is talk about some of the ways that American Farmland Trust will be strengthening its commitment to farmland protection across the country and the South especially. One, establishing the National Agricultural Land Network. Two, providing new leadership in key locations. So American Farmland Trust is using our science and research to enlighten us on where we will locate future offices in the Southeast. Protecting more farmland ourselves as a land trust and with partners. And it's important to note here that American Farmland Trust typically only takes conservation easements in areas where there's not a viable land trust, PACE, or PDR program in place. 4, we want to advocate for stronger state and federal policies. We want to use this research and we want to work with you to use this research to change state and federal policies to conserve more farmland. Promoting research-based decision-making. So using data to plan for the future of agriculture is very important. And that actually brings me to the next slide. What more can Alabama do? We'll analyze and use and map agricultural land trends and conditions using AFT's microsite available with this data. Strengthen or adopt a coordinated suite of policies. So Chris was talking about this earlier. Planning for the future of agriculture, that has been illustrated clearly in the responses to your the poll questions. So first, it's critically important that each city and or county have a professional planning staff and a planning commission. Sometimes cities and counties each have their own planning staffs and planning commissions, but it's typically a better practice to have joint planning functions, a joint planning staff, and a joint planning commission, even if you're not a merged city-county government. Next, to have a comprehensive plan that is adopted with a goal of protected farmland in each community, in each county. Next is an urban growth boundary so that non-agricultural uses stay within a defined area and agricultural uses exist beyond that. And so you don't have non-agricultural uses in your rural area, and that allows agriculture to thrive in the future. Next is agricultural zoning, so that you do not allow non-agricultural uses in those rural areas that may negatively impact adjoining agricultural uses or lead to sprawl. Next is a large lot minimums in rural areas. And what I mean here is that we don't want lots that allow, we do not recommend lots that allow low density residential development. So we're talking about 2, 5, 10, 15 acre, 20 acre tracts. Anything smaller, those are the small tracts that we would generally describe as low density residential development. You want larger viable agricultural units. And next is farmland protection. And that can take the form of PACE programs and PDR programs, as Chris has already discussed, or local land trusts, where easements are donated and held for conservation in perpetuity. So next is supporting farm viability and access to land, planning for the future of agriculture, not just around it. So we recommend, I should say, large critical masses of farmland for the future of agriculture. So we want the Holstein and not the Dalmatian. Having large tracts of protected land rather than smaller tracts surrounded by non-agricultural uses. Save the best, but don't forget the rest. And that's just part of an overall planning strategy for each community. I'll turn it over to Chris.
Great, thank you, Billy. I did want to, while you were talking, I did look up to confirm my earlier answer about the crop data layers. And in fact, it says, I'm just going to say that we mapped land cover and use by combining data from the National Resources Inventory, the National Land Cover Data Layer, the NRCS Soil Survey Geographic Database, so SURGO, and the Digital General Soil Map, or StatsGo. And then for the purpose of creating the PDR values, we looked at a number of additional things, including cropland data layers. And so I hope that is helpful. And again, you can find that all on the methodology section. There is a question that is, I think is best for you to answer, Billy, which is, you had mentioned, or maybe as I had mentioned, cost of community services studies.
Yes.
Can you talk about that a little bit more as a tool for folks?
Sure. American Farmland Trust has completed over 83 cost of community services studies around the nation. And generally, cost of community services studies look at the cost of providing services to urban areas and agricultural areas. Generally, the results from these studies are similar in that sprawl uses more in services than it pays in taxes, and ag uses less in services than it pays in taxes. The core urban areas in cities use less in services than they pay in taxes as well. So even though communities are creating a net gain on agriculture and core urban areas, it's not enough to compensate for the sprawl, the services that are provided to sprawl. And it makes a lot of sense. The further out you extend sewer infrastructure, water infrastructure, roads, sidewalks, street lights, police, fire, all of those types of services, the more expensive it gets. And so, as we say, the old saying goes, cows don't go to school. So cost of community services studies, you can go to American Farmland Trust website, farmlandinfo.org, which is our data clearinghouse, and just put cost of community services studies in the search field, and you'll see a voluminous amount of information on that type of work. Thanks, Chris.
Great, thank you. So not seeing any more questions right now, I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about the Farmland Information Center and about our new National Agricultural Land Network. And before I do, let me launch our last poll. This last poll is going to help us, we hope, in our National Agricultural Land Network and also with the Farmland Information Center. We are always wanting to know how best we can be supportive of those doing work at the state and local level around agricultural land protection or planning for agriculture, or advocates who just want to know more to be able to make the case for saving farm and ranch land. So we are hoping that you can let us know which of these types of technical assistance would be most useful to you. And if there's some type of assistance that you don't see on here and would really hope that we could provide, if you want to write that in on your question line, that would be great as well. So let's, again, you can select more than one, and we'll take a minute for people to answer. Okay, Beth, what are we seeing here? This is great. Land use planning tools. You are not alone in wanting this. We have, through these webinar series, we have realized that we need to increase the amount of technical assistance and ways of thinking about how to provide support around land use planning tools. Also helpful to know that there is interest in these policy tools, so please be on the lookout for these next series of policy webinars. Let me for a minute talk about the Farmland Information Center, as Billy just mentioned it, that it is in fact a clearinghouse. It is a collaboration we've had with USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service for decades. It is an unbelievable source of information just for just about anything you would want to know related to agricultural land protection and many other things. One can find materials that make the case, so the cost of community services studies that Billy was talking about, economic impact of agriculture and economic impact of farmland protection programs. We know that those types of programs help to reinvest in agriculture, help farmers who want to transition their land to their kids, that there are lots of values, and we have lots of studies that show the economic impact of permanently protected land. There are information available for landowners, for if there's anyone who knows of folks who are interested in the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program. There are lots of materials. For those of you who are looking for statistics, there are many materials there. So you can go to farmlandinfo.org. You can also call, and they actually do answer the phone, and they do take their messages and return calls. So if you have a specific question, feel free to call in. And then the National Agricultural Land Network is newly launched. This is intended as a way to build the collective capacity of all of us working in agricultural land protection and retaining farmland. It is membership based, but it's free. Again, it's intended largely for those who are in the weeds and thinking about agricultural land, saving the land that sustains us on a regular day-to-day basis. We are hoping to do much more peer networking and information sharing We recognize there's lots of innovations going on around the country, and we want people to be able to talk about those and learn from each other. It is open to both land trusts, to public agencies, so that's county planners, that's state departments of agriculture or state departments of natural resources, to organizations that do sort of allied work around agriculture, can be members or collaborators. I hope folks will join. You can join by going to farmland.org/NALN. We will be having additional programming. This was sort of our launch of that through the webinar series. Feel free to reach out to me if you have questions. And since we do have a little bit more time, Billy, we have just a couple more. Well, we have one last question. Let me pop this out here.
I saw those questions, Chris, and I'm happy to answer them if you would like for me to.
Yes, I think that would be great.
Thanks, Chris. One question is about people want the rural lifestyle. So how do we, I won't read this verbatim, but basically, how do we balance people who want to live in the rural lifestyle with agriculture? And so I think that lifestyle is the key word in this question. People that typically want to live on the low density residential lots, the 5-acre lots, the 10-acre, the 15-acre, they want the rural lifestyle, but they don't always anticipate what it's like to live in the rural area. Using rural roads to get into town, the lack of services out there, the noises, the smells, all of those things when they're surrounded by agriculture. There's a big, it's a conflicting land use. So in this case, the community does what's the planning vision for the community does what's best for the county as a whole. And that is having, you're not saying that anyone is not moving to the rural area. You're just saying if they move to the rural area, they're going to live on a viable agricultural unit and not an estate lot. So that's one thing, that's one way to answer that question. The next one is success stories of communities that have made policy changes with low pushback. So I'll give one success story that I'm intimately familiar with. And I wouldn't describe it as low pushback, but I would describe it as long-term determined policy change. And so in Lexington, Kentucky, when there had been a proliferation of 10-acre lotting, 10-acre lot development, and 4,700 acres was lost, they knew that something was wrong when they took that 4,700 acres and put it inside the urban area, and they realized that they could have gotten 20,000 typical residential lots, but instead they only got 429. So they knew it was a gross misuse of land. So the mayor at that time appointed an ad hoc committee, a broad cross section of the community, and they developed a rural land management plan that made two recommendations. One was to increase the minimum lot size from 10 acres to 40 acres. And the second recommendation was to implement a purchase of development rights program to compensate the landowner for the loss of the 10-acre right. And that plan also established a goal of 50,000 acres of permanently protected farmland to retain the agricultural industries in that county. Now, Lexington had the first urban growth boundary in the United States in 1958. It has expanded and contracted many times over the last 50 plus years, but it has not been expanded since 1996. And there is still 17,000 acres available on the inside for urban development. So the key is planning for the future of agriculture and planning for your urban areas, because they go hand in glove. The more you hold the line on sprawl, the more vibrant your downtowns become, the more street life there is, the more variety of housing types, the more pedestrian oriented communities that you have, more walkable, bikeable communities and access to culture and other things, and local food and farmers markets. Your downtowns become more vibrant. So that's just an example. Vibrant communities that are surrounded by a productive rural landscape. That is planning for the future of agriculture.
Great. Thank you, Billy. Well, I think that is, those are the questions. So I think we can wrap this up. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. We will be sending out a registration, a webinar link. Please feel free to share that. And Billy, I know you like to give your email address.
Sure. I'm available at bvanpelt@farmland.org. You can go to farmland.org and find me. Happy to help with any questions that you have. And I'm also available on LinkedIn if you would like to connect. We're looking forward to working with you in Alabama. We have partners in the area, the Georgia-Alabama Land Trust. I know their executive director well, as well as the mobile baykeeper. So great partners and great stakeholders and supporters that have been with AFT for many years, and look forward to helping you all, serving as a resource and a partner in the future.
Great. Thank you, Billy. Thank you all. Have a great afternoon.